So it's been a little while since Bethesda was the topic of conversation. To be honest, there hasn't really been much of a reason to talk about them. Starfield hasn't really meaningfully improved since its launch over 2 years ago, and the DLC didn't really do anything noteworthy either. But I have been seeing some chatter floating around the web on a few particular topics. There's been some articles put out recently that have some controversial statements being made about space, and some other sectors of the internet, despite not having any meaningful news about it for like 7 years, have been talking about and speculating on Elder Scrolls 6 and what kind of a game we should expect from them. And it kind of makes me want to reflect a little bit on Bethesda as a whole and its history of releases, because I feel like if you really look at and examine Bethesda's past, it really doesn't raise a lot of hope for its future. So to start with, let's talk about that article that I've been seeing making the rounds. The long and short of it is that it's this interview with a former longtime Bethesda employee who worked on Starfield, and they rather infamously made the claim that space is inherently boring, and attributed that fact to at least in part of the reason for why Starfield didn't do so well. And naturally, a lot of people had a very negative response to that information. I mean, that was just a wild thing to say. Hell, it's beyond wild to say that. It's in the outer wilds. This is having a massive effect on my view of games involving other planets or outer worlds. Hell, I doubt that even Aliens in Isolation could solve this problem. I guess in the end, it's just dead space. But okay, joking aside, I do think that people are kind of jumping the gun a bit on this one. If you actually read the article, the context of the quote is that the guy is actually criticizing certain aspects of Starfield, like the overuse of procedural generation, which I think that most of us can actually pretty easily agree with. And he's not saying that space is boring in gaming, he's saying that space in real life is boring. And I mean, let's be honest here, he's completely right on that front. Space is really fucking boring in real life. Trust me, I actually originally majored in astronomy before I pivoted to game design, and a lot of the work involves basically just telling a telescope to take like an 8-hour exposure while you play Mario Kart waiting for it to finish, just so that you can then do a ton of esoteric math to find out that you're actually just looking at yet another lumpy rock in the asteroid belt. But I think that this is still an interesting point to consider, because when you think about it, this reasoning can arguably be applied to most settings. A medieval frozen tundra is not an inherently interesting setting. A nuclear wasteland is not an inherently interesting setting on its own. These settings only become interesting when you do something interesting with them. So obviously, yes, space can be cool and interesting if you do something cool with it, despite how boring it is in real life. But that then begs the question, why did Bethesda spend so many years working on Starfield trying to replicate the most boring aspects of space? And why were they unable to see that this clearly wasn't going to make for a fun exploration experience when it was so obvious to so many players on release? And we know that they didn't just see this as a problem or something, considering that rather infamously, right after Starfield's release, we saw Bethesda making a fool of themselves when they were replying directly to Steam reviews, trying to make the argument that space wasn't boring, because when the Apollo astronauts were on the moon, they were having a lot of fun, so therefore having 90% of the game's exploration take place on barren rocks with nothing to find, clearly Starfield can't be boring either. The fact that this game was developed for so long and yet it released in the state that it did, and that instead of making the argument that they ran out of time or money or something, because they clearly didn't, they instead tried to argue, no, the boring space rocks are actually good and you're wrong for not finding it fun. This kind of behavior is what makes me so concerned for Elder Scrolls 6. It's not that Starfield is a bad game that I personally hate. It's the fact that the Bethesda leadership seems to be so fundamentally out of touch with what their consumers want, or even just basic game design principles, that I have no idea how I can possibly trust them to do good by Elder Scrolls 6. And I think that this only gets worse when you zoom out and look at their other games beyond Starfield, because while I do personally think that Starfield is their worst game in recent memory, there are also a lot of aspects of their prior releases and the trends that you can follow throughout those releases that only make me raise further concerns. I've been seeing some people trying to compare Bethesda to CD Projekt Red and their releases because, well, to be frank, they are also a gaming company that has a somewhat rocky history and is fairly well known for releasing broken games and having to fix them up later. The surface level parallels are at least somewhat warranted. So I have seen some people try to defend Bethesda by saying that, like, yeah, like CD Projekt also has released some broken games, but they also have a pretty good track record of fixing their games over time, and they've improved dramatically on prior releases and addressed criticisms and whatnot, which shows that a studio can, in fact, turn things around and put out some real masterpieces despite having a rocky history. Thus, the argument goes that no matter how bad Starfield was, there's always a chance that Elder Scrolls 6 could be the next Skyrim. But let's actually look at the history of these two companies for a second and try to compare and contrast how things have gone over time. For example, a lot of people point to how messed up of a game The Witcher 1 was. Like, it's not a terrible game, I don't think, but it's pretty easy to argue that it's extremely dated, and even at the time, it played and controlled very strangely, and it's only made worse by modern standards. It was a very difficult game for a lot of people to get into back then in 2007 and still is to this day. And the argument goes that despite how weird of a game that was, CD Projekt went on to iterate and dramatically improve upon their gameplay systems and ideas until eventually they released Witcher 3, and even the Witcher 3 DLCs as well on their own, which are still considered like modern classics to this day. But like, let's actually look at the context here. The Witcher 1 was, as far as I can tell, literally CD Projekt's first ever game that they ever made back in 2007, so it makes sense that their first ever attempt at this sort of thing might have ended up being a little jank. And the fact that their releases have gone so much better and more complex over time suggests that they've mostly just improved their skills as a developer, while also listening to feedback on their prior games and used it to improve the design of their future games based on it. There is a pretty linear progression in quality from The Witcher 1 through the entire Witcher series and then on to Cyberpunk. By comparison, people have been complaining about a lot of the same issues in Bethesda games for literal decades. People have been complaining about things like poorly written characters and poorly written factions, or the eroding of any halfway decent actual role-playing elements, or their boring combat design, or terrible level progression, and just all kinds of things like that, and many of these complaints have been around since at least Fallout 3 or earlier, and yet so many of their releases since then, all the way up to and including Starfield, still have many of these same issues. And it's not like Fallout 3 was even their first game. It was their first Fallout game after acquiring the property, but they had been making games for years long before that. But I guess you could argue that since it was like their first attempt at a Fallout game, it can be somewhat justified that maybe their writing quality and RPG mechanics didn't quite live up to the prior games in the franchise because it was a different studio and whatnot. But like, then we move on to Fallout 4, and the RPG mechanics are even weaker, and the writing gets even worse. And like, keep in mind that while Fallout 3 did get a lot of praise, and by all means there's plenty to enjoy there, even back in the day it was being criticized for its poorer role-playing elements and some of the writing issues and whatnot compared to the original Fallout 1 and 2. Not to mention that we also got Fallout New Vegas by the original devs, which brought back a lot of the kinds of actual role-playing that people liked from the original Fallout game. So Bethesda had 2 games worth of feedback of people basically going like, hey, we like deep role-playing mechanics and well-written stories and characters in our Fallout games. And despite that, they ended up going all in on having a voiced protagonist that directly severely limited their ability to write meaningful dialogue choices and create good role-playing opportunities. And I mean, hell, it's probably not a fair comparison since they obviously had a very different goal in mind for this game, but I gotta admit that it's even more frustrating that right after Fallout 4, they then doubled down on this again with Fallout 76's original release, where they were bragging about the world having no NPCs and, as such, basically no real role-playing systems at all. And like, finally, with Starfield, I really feel like we've reached the ultimate encapsulation of these kinds of problems. Like, everyone everyone who has played their games knows that one of the strongest elements of pretty much every major Bethesda release is that their worlds are fun to walk around in and explore. Like, for as much as I like to dunk on many of their games like Fallout 4, I still can't deny that I myself played that game for a ton of hours because I did still enjoy exploring the wasteland. Well, that, and also I am a huge sucker for any game that lets me build a house. But besides that, for as many problems as these games often have with their writing and role-playing elements and whatnot, at least they usually have that sense of exploration going for them as a huge appeal for most players. But then they put out Starfield and they didn't even manage to get that right. Like, instead of having an expansive, detailed world to explore, they chopped it up into a million different loading screens. Instead of having the feeling of looking out into the horizon and wondering if you can physically walk to and climb that mountain that you see in the distance, you're forced to navigate boring menus before you watch a cutscene that just fast travels you to where you want to go. Instead of filling the game with memorable locations and new surprises around every corner, they just put a barren, like 1,000 barren floating rocks with the same 5 landmarks sprinkled around on every single one of them. They spent nearly a decade making Starfield, and I guess they just never stopped to recognize the fact that the systems they were designing are completely antithetical to one of the few things that people almost universally praise about their games. Like, this, to me, is the fundamental problem with Bethesda as a studio. It's like they have these ideas in the concept stage, like putting in a fully voiced protagonist, or trying to replicate the vastness and emptiness of space, or hell, even the whole universe-hopping New Game Plus thing as well. Like, despite working on these games for years and years, they are neither able to make these systems actually work to reinforce and improve the game that they're making, nor are they able to recognize that it's clearly not working in time to then scrap the idea and try to actually make the game better by removing it. Like, with any creative endeavor, there's always going to come a time when you need to kill your darlings, whether it's a piece of cool concept art that you're just unable to make fit into your project, or an idea that just ended up sounding better in your head than it was on paper. You often have to cut ideas that you love from the final product in order to make it work. And I swear that Bethesda's philosophy almost feels like the complete opposite of this. Like, I'm sure that there are plenty of things that do end up getting cut for sure, but they seem to be very much a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks kind of company. Every game they put out seems to be like they always have to make it an everything game where you can do anything and go anywhere. You could be a pirate or a rogue or a wizard, and you could steal anything from anyone, and so on and so forth. But that kind of philosophy just ends up being completely unfocused. Like, you know, jack of all trades, master of none territory. Instead of focusing on allowing the player to do a few specific things and really making those systems deep and complex and interesting, they create a million incredibly shallow systems that aren't nearly as fun to play as any game that is smaller in scope but more focused on those ideas. Like, Starfield, for example, has a base building element, and it's kind of reminiscent of like a factory building game with you having to mine resources and ship them around the galaxy to different outposts and stuff, but the implementation of the idea in Starfield is so shallow compared to any actual factory game like Satisfactory or Factorio, or hell, even like a average Minecraft mod, if I'm being honest. Baldur's Gate 3 is, I think, another good comparison point, because ultimately it is really a much smaller game in scope than basically any Bethesda game in many aspects. It is still very open-ended, sure, and you can explore a lot of different locations in different orders, but ultimately the size and scope of the world is fairly limited in size. Like, it's not that big. Not to mention that it's broken up into about a half dozen areas that you pretty much have to visit in a linear sequence. Like, you can't sprint right to the Act 3 area and then circle back around to one of the Act 2 locations or something like that. But because the game is so much more focused and smaller in scale, they're able to then fill those smaller areas and make them really, really dense with meaningful content. And as a result, despite being smaller in scope, I feel like I was able to find a lot more interesting things to explore and experience a lot more interesting interesting role-playing opportunities than a game like Starfield could possibly provide, despite having an entire galaxy to explore with hundreds of planets to land on. Not to mention that I would argue that their problems with scope creep are almost certainly the main reason for why Bethesda's games tend to have so many technical problems. Like, a lot of people like to jump on the bandwagon of blaming Bethesda's ancient engine that they use, calling it out of date and saying they need to move on to something new, but that is a massive oversimplification of the problem. Like, a game engine is not a monolithic singular thing that you just simply swap out during development. It gets built on and expanded upon over time by the studio with each release, and there is a lot of value in working with an engine that your developers have a lot of experience in, instead of having to train them on something entirely new. No, I think the bigger problem is definitely the scope of the games themselves. When you focus so much on making an everything game with hundreds, if not thousands of different systems that all have to interact with each other in a massive game world that spans an entire continent, let alone multiple planets, it becomes impossible to ensure that all of those systems are going to play nice with each other flawlessly. Like, I have to imagine that running QA for these games has to be an absolute nightmare. And again, they've been infamous for having these technical problems in their games for literal decades now. It is routine that every Bethesda game is known to launch in an extremely buggy state and have all kinds of unintended exploits and whatnot. And yet, what do they do despite having this problem every single time? We gotta have 4 times the map size, 16 times the detail, 1,000 planets to explore, more, bigger, keep adding to the scope, we gotta keep adding more and more to it, and like, it's just yet another example of them refusing to do any self-reflection. I don't know about you, but it's just not impressive to have a big game world anymore, especially when it's just procedurally generated. A small-scale game like Disco Elysium that takes place over just a handful of city blocks, but has deep, rich, and interesting characters with a ton of fun interactions that you can do, is always going to be infinitely more interesting, to me at least, than a game that tries to brag about how impressively large its world is, while they fill it up with generic copy-paste landmarks and one-dimensional NPCs. And yet they keep trying to focus on making their games bigger and bigger, despite it clearly being a detriment to both their overall design as well as the immense amount of technical depth that they keep accruing. And like, I'm not saying that they need to shrink their games down to the size of a city block or something. I'm just saying that they need to stop forcing themselves to keep going bigger and bigger when they clearly have been biting off more than they can chew for decades. And like, just to touch on those technical problems one last time, since it's such a big infamous factor in pretty much all of their games, I think I've made it clear by now that Bethesda's games being buggy is far from the main problem I have with them. It's certainly a big problem, yes, but like I've said, this is just another thing people compare between like Bethesda and CD Projekt, since they both tend to have very broken games on launch. I mean, if you're not familiar with how the Witcher games launch, surely you must have at least heard about Cyberpunk's absolutely disastrous launch day, but like, there's still a huge difference between these broken games, because even when I was originally playing Cyberpunk at launch in 2020 and I was experiencing dozens of insane bugs an hour with things breaking left and right, I could still tell, even back then, that underneath all of that broken garbage, there was still a diamond in the rough there to enjoy. The characters were still well written, the storyline was engaging, the city was fun to explore. Even if I was sometimes clipping through my car's roof with my pants off for some reason, there was still a lot of the game that I actually really liked, despite all of the game-breaking bugs I kept running into. But with games like Fallout 4 or Starfield or whatever, you could fix every single technical problem with those games, and I would still hate or dislike so many aspects of them. The problems with the writing, the storytelling, the world building, the combat, the leveling systems, these have nothing to do with their games being buggy. I mean, hell, I don't even remember my time with Starfield being that buggy. Like, yeah, there was definitely a few minor issues that I remember cropping up from time to time, but all things considered, I don't don't really recall running into too many major technical problems in the short time that I was playing it. So like, even though it was in an absolutely unacceptable and broken state, I still had way more fun playing Cyberpunk at launch than I did playing Starfield when it was working exactly as intended, because Cyberpunk actually had redeeming qualities under all of those technical issues. And like, this is also one of the reasons why people love modding their games, because mods can at least alleviate, if not fix, many of these issues, whether it's a technical problem or a design problem. Like, if the leveling system is trash, just install a mod to revamp the level ups. If you're running into a ton of bugs, there's probably a fan-made patch that'll fix them. If the combat is bad, just install a mod that adds a whole new melee system to replace it. And like, if you enjoy these games through modding, then yeah, more power to you, I guess, but the fans shouldn't have to keep routinely fixing Bethesda's games for them. And the fact that all of these small independent creators are able to keep making all of these frankly impressive mods that dramatically improve their games, I think that just shows that Bethesda should be capable of making and implementing cool ideas and improvements to their games like we see from the modding community, and yet they just consistently don't. And as I have been saying this entire time, I think that these problems just show that there must be some kind of core, structural, foundational problem with how Bethesda is being run. When a company has problems like this, it's almost never a problem with just a simple lack of talent or something like that. Like, the issue is almost certainly not that their designers are just bad at their job, or that they have no access to anyone that could write a good storyline or something like that. No, the problem is usually that the talented people in the company are just unable to speak up or express themselves or share their ideas, or if they can, then those ideas are just not being listened to or being shut down unnecessarily. Maybe leadership is just too boneheaded and keeps pushing bad ideas down the pipeline. Maybe they keep refusing to listen to feedback, or their QA department when they raise valid concerns. I don't know if there's really any way of knowing exactly what that core problem is, but it is almost certainly not just one person ruining everything on their own. It's almost certainly something more systemic with how Bethesda as a company operates. But Bethesda is rather infamously a fairly black box company when it comes to revealing their internal workings, so it's kinda hard to do much but speculate on what's going on behind the scenes. But whatever the problem is, if they are unable to meaningfully reflect on themselves and identify and address potential issues internally, well then, I have no reason to believe that Elder Scrolls 6 will be anything but a continuation of the same painful trends that we have been seeing them hit for literal decades at this point, with all of the same issues that have been in every single game that they've put out for like the last 20 years. But, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. I'm curious where people's hopes are for Elder Scrolls 6 at this point, and how that correlates with your enjoyment of their recent releases, so let me know what you think about that stuff. And I do think it is worth pointing out here at the end that it's not that I want Elder Scrolls to be bad. Like, I know I've been dunking on Bethesda for a while now, but I mean, in a perfect world, every game would be amazing, right? Like, I would love... Like, the ideal scenario is that Bethesda proves me wrong and the next game ends up blowing everyone away with quality and becomes the next Skyrim and everything. But you need to earn that kind of faith, and everything that they've done so far only leads me to think that they don't deserve it. But for now, if you liked the video, make sure to leave me a like, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell if you want to see more content like this. And if you want to throw a little extra my way, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.